Welcome to Not in a Huff with Jackson Huff, where we interview newsmakers, storytellers, and all-around interesting people. Sit back, relax, unless you're driving, and enjoy the show. Here's Jackson.
Hello. I am Jackson Huff. This is Not in a Huff. Thanks so much for joining me. As always, really appreciate it. This week I'm speaking with Peter Young. Now, Peter has an interesting story, but one that is becoming more and more prevalent, and that is getting sucked into a micro cult. Of course, we know, some of the biggest cults of all times. We know Jim Jones and Jonestown. We know, Charles Manson. We know the Branch Davidians. We know the Moonies, all these different cults. We've had people on from large cults in the past when it comes to the Source family commune, or the Source family, as our guests talked about. These are huge cults. These are cults that have had documentaries about them. These are cults that have had hundreds of people at one point following along with one cult leader. But what is becoming more and more prevalent in the world, and one that has been being written about quite a bit, Mr. Young's going to talk about that a little bit in this conversation, is the growth of microcults. And what a microcult is a group of people that have, maybe a family guru. They have a person that everyone looks up to, but instead of, 200-300 people, maybe it's just one family that listens to this person. Maybe it's a couple families and 12, 15, 20 people. But it's a tight group, a tight-knit family, basically, that is following along with a cult leader. No matter how big the cult is, there's these cult leaders that take ownership of a small group of people. And that's exactly what happens in the story this week. We're going to learn about a person named Uncle Robert. Sounds innocent enough, sounds friendly enough. He is somebody who back 20, 30, 40 years ago kind of took hold of this certain family, and we're going to get into that. It's not really known whether there's other families involved, but we're going to focus on one family. It's certainly a small cult, but Uncle Robert basically took control of almost every aspect of their life. It started with two parents. The parents had children. The children started following Uncle Robert, and the children grew up. They started having families of their own, and those families started following Uncle Robert as well. So at the largest, we're talking 12, 13 adults and some kids along with it. Now, what happens when parts of the family decide not to follow Uncle Robert? What happens when they start questioning things? Well, that's when we see how powerful this micro cult is, because the family starts disowning their own children when they decide not to follow Uncle Robert. This is just a crazy, crazy story. This story comes from Peter Young, who married into this family. He married his ex-wife now, named Paige, that grew up following this Uncle Robert, and he didn't know exactly what he was getting himself into. He heard that this family has a guru. He seemed friendly, a little bit crazy, but friendly enough, so he kind of went full steam ahead, and through the next 20 years, he learned just how much of a hold Uncle Robert had on the family, just how powerful he was. And at the end, we learned that his power over Paige and his family was stronger than Peter's marriage. And they get divorced, and parts of their own children stick with the cult, and parts leave with Peter. But this is a crazy, crazy story. I don't normally use the word crazy, but this story is just extremely impactful. It seems so bizarre to most people to think that this one person was able to create such a hold, such a power over people. It's I don't want to say easier, but we see a little bit of groupthink when it comes to these huge cults with 200-300 people, and you're moving away to the commune, and you kind of have to go along to get along there because now you've given up everything and you're there. This time Uncle Robert lives in California, this family lives in Idaho, and somehow he's still holding a power over them. We're going to talk about some crazy circumstances and we're going to go into deeper stories with this, but at one point Peter was asked to give up his spare wedding ring to Uncle Robert because he needed a wedding ring. There's a time when one of their children needed dental work, and they had to call Uncle Robert to make sure that was okay before they let the dentist do the work. Just some interesting things. It kind of hits the breaking point when Paige decides that she wants to have an heir apparent to Uncle Robert and father a child for him. This is just a crazy story. Again, I'm using that word crazy that I don't like, but it's a powerful story about being able to wake up and see that, hey, this is not right. This went so far off of what we thought was happening, and unfortunately, Peter woke up 20 years later and realized things. I think that throughout the entire marriage and the entire time with Uncle Robert, he had kind of figured out, hey, this is not right. But it took that long and some really interesting things to finally hit that breaking point. This conversation, I think you're going to enjoy it. It's wild. That's all I'm going to say. Just to learn about this, small micro cult that just completely shaped this family and is continuing to shape them and frankly continuing to break them apart. So I want you to take to heart what Peter's saying. He has a book where he goes into more depth about this. It's called Stop the Tall Man, Save the Tiger, which sounds interesting, but we're going to talk about what that means exactly because it does have some meaning there. Yeah, I think you're going to really enjoy this one if you like to hear anything about cults or just human nature. This is a powerful one. So here is Peter Young. I'm here today with Peter Young. Mr. Young, how are you?
I'm great, Jackson. How are you?
I'm good. If you would just introduce yourself first.
Sure. Peter Young. I'm an author. I've written 2 books, a novel called The Blue Team about faith in basketball. And then I recently released a memoir called Stop the Tall Man, Save the Tiger. And I've used to be a sports broadcaster for a long time, but now sell real estate and live out in just outside of Bozeman, Montana.
I love it. And we're obviously going to talk a lot about your memoir. Right in the beginning of the book, I think it was interesting, definitely after having read a good chunk of it, it's where you said that this story, a lot of people told you, hey, you should just take kind of elements of this and write a fiction story. And you were like, I can't do that because if someone read it as fiction, no one would believe it. But it actually all happened, and it's just a fascinating story. We're going to get into that, but I want to start out with what you mentioned as far as your previous career, because that's pretty cool to people. I think that could have been a podcast too, just talking about being a sports broadcaster. Talk a little bit about that early career when you were doing those things.
Sure. Well, I'll give you the Reader's Digest version of my life. So I grew up in New Jersey, played basketball, and I was going to be the next Larry Bird. So I went to college at George Washington University, played for the Colonials, and now they've changed their name, but played Division I, and I was not the next Larry Bird. It was not very good. So then I got into coaching when I graduated, and I was going to be the next John Wooden. And I coached for 2 years, 1 year at college at CU, University of Colorado, 1 at high school. And I was quite immature at the time, so I was not a very good coach. And then I got into broadcasting, was going to be the next Bob Costas of outdoor sports. I joke I was the Bob Costas of sports nobody watched. So I was with OLN, the Outdoor Life Network, and then did some other networks as well, ESPN and A&E, TNN, Fox Northwest. And then one day, the president of OLN decided he didn't like the sound of my voice. So I had to get a new job, and that's what happened.
Yeah, well, I like that you that you shot for the stars. It wasn't just be a good coach or be a good basketball player. You basically pick the best ones of your time and be like, that's who I'm going to be. I'm going to be that.
Well, and that's part of the message of my book, The Blue Teams, which the message is, be yourself, number one, right? The world doesn't need a next Larry Bird because he's already taken, right? So be yourself. But also, my identity is in something greater than myself. So for me, it's Jesus Christ, I'm a Christian. And so basketball or coaching or broadcasting is something I do. It's not who I am. So the idea is that you don't put your identity in that thing because you're not going to have a great night every night when you play basketball, right? But you are still something else, right? You don't put so much pressure on the thing that you do. And that's the message of my first book.
No, I love that. And I noticed too that you said you grew up in New Jersey, which is very different from Colorado and certainly different from Idaho and Montana where you live now. Were you just always drawn to that outdoor world? Why did you leave the West Coast and have really never looked back?
Great question. No one's asked me that. So I
think I said West Coast. I meant East Coast.
Yeah. So I was a gym rat, just lived in the gym, never tan, right? Kiki Vandeweghe had that great saying, the guy that played for the Nuggets, UCLA. And then I went to school in DC and I redshirted one year. So I had a fifth year coming up. So my buddy and I, when we graduated, we flew out to San Francisco and we rented a car and drove around the Northwest, Oregon, Washington, Idaho, Montana, Colorado. And I fell in love on that trip. So then I played my fifth year for Coach Mike Jarvis. We were finally good. Jarvis then went on to St. John's, great coach. And I've been out West ever since. That was 1991.
Well, I want to kind of get into this second book and kind of start at the beginning. And I think that the beginning was you meeting your future wife at that time. Talk about a little bit about the early years, because I think the early years were relatively grand. So talk a little bit about that. I think this was before we meet a character that we're going to meet here in a little bit named Uncle Robert. But talk a little bit about those early years.
Sure. I was living in Pocatello, Idaho. So this is mid-90s. And I was doing the 6 and 10 sports for the ABC affiliate. Flat broke, but loved it. Loved my job. And I had seen Paige, that was my former wife, seen her around town, stunningly beautiful, 6'1", long blonde hair, athletic. Didn't know her. I was at the gym working out with a guy named Gary. And I described her to him. He says, "Oh, I know who that is. That's Paige Clausen. But be careful because she has this really weird family guru." So, before I'd ever even met her, I heard about the guru, which turned out to be this mysterious Uncle Robert. So then I met Paige at a singles Bible study, which is, of course, why you go to those things, right? And then, we started dating right away. But then about 2 weeks in, I was 90% sure, Jackson, I wanted to marry her. But I needed to meet her dad and his Uncle Robert because she talked about him all the time. So I met her dad around Thanksgiving. We've been dating about a month. And, odd. There were certainly some odd moments. One of them was I went to go use the bathroom down the hall, stood up to pee because I'm a guy, finished, flushed, washed my hands, opened the door, and there he is standing there, and he was listening. And he says, in our house, the men sit to pee because it keeps the toilet cleaner. And Uncle Robert taught us that. And I probably heard that phrase 100 times over the next 20 years. So then I finally met this Uncle Robert a few months later. And odd, yes, kind of bizarre, but I, at the time, kind of thought he was harmless, and which was not the case. But I was in love. I was blinded by love. And so then, Paige and I got married a few months later. First child came along 10 months later. And for the first few years of our marriage, I thought I was the best husband ever. She was the best wife ever. We were setting the bar for all time. And of course, it wasn't the case because lurking behind the scenes in a role that was far greater than I knew was Uncle Robert.
Yeah, and I want you, this is the hardest question because there's just so much to the situation, but I want you to tell us, I guess, who Uncle Robert was. We're going to talk about exactly some of the teachings and some of the interesting stuff that he said, but as a whole, who was Uncle Robert?
Sure. Uncle Robert's name is Robert Booty. He came from Syria. So, he's not a blood uncle. I'm 6'5", typical North European looks, Paige's family, again, blonde hair, blue eyes. So he met Paige's parents at a tiny seminary in Fresno, California, before Paige was even born. And he kind of glommed on like a parasite to Jack and Kathy, Paige's parents. And they had this very, lopsided relationship where he was just kind of this dominant, I guess probably at the time, cult wannabe. So Paige grew up where he was always this authority figure on everything. And he really, again, dominated the thoughts and actions of Paige's parents and their family. Even though he lived in California, They lived in, at the time they were in BC, Canada, British Columbia, and then down in Idaho. But he was always, again, the family guru is really probably the best way to put it. He was always around lurking. If he was not there in person, always just a phone call away.
And I want you to kind of talk about some of his teachings, the highlights of it in kind of the email that you sent me. And I'll tell you, I try to be as unbiased as possible. I've talked to people from all different faiths and even people that are still actively in, what people would consider cults. But I was eating lunch when you sent this to me, and one particular part about the casinos that almost made me spit out my lunch. So I want you to talk a little bit about some of the teachings that he had. Let's start with some of the, I guess, bizarre ones, and we can get to some of the less bizarre.
Sure. Well, I would probably say the most bizarre one is that, for Uncle Robert, his main theological point was that all of recorded history is a struggle between Christians and Jews. It goes back to, if you know your Bible, Jacob and Esau. Esau becomes Edom, which becomes modern Jewry. Jacob becomes the 12 tribes, which is modern Christianity. So literally every war, recession, depression, plane crash, you name it, is a Jewish conspiracy to try and dominate the world. Wow. Okay. So, he kind of threw that out there a few years after we got married. And I was the one that kept asking too many questions about it. And he got tired of my questions. But, Paige and her parents bought it hook, line, and sinker. They believed everything he said. So in addition to that, there was America's sovereign national credit, where he expected, everybody, you and me and anybody else, could write a check basically on the bank of themselves and borrow as much money as they wanted to, which of course is idiotic, would lead to hyperinflation overnight. And then the casinos. So Jack and Kathy would go visit Uncle Robert during the summers. They had teaching jobs during the summer. They'd go down there for about a month, kind of like, sit at the foot of Buddha, right? And they would have this halo effect. Whatever Uncle Robert had been drumming into their heads, they couldn't stop talking about. So when they came back this one summer, maybe we'd been married 7-8 years, Jack tells me that, casinos are the true churches in America. And the churches that you go to on a Sunday, are just a waste of time. But the churches, the casinos are the true churches, because anybody can go into a casino, regardless of your bank account, your success, race, creed, gender, whatever, and be blessed by the Lord. Which I would say, okay, but, I don't see anybody worshiping the Lord in a casino. I see them worshiping, maybe their drinks, their cigarette, and money. That's it. And then, oh, by the way, he also called them, the casinos, his office. Because see, Uncle Robert never had a real job. Not that I saw. And I've, I was around the guy for almost 25 years. His wife had a job at a hospital, so she made the money. And he had no money. We would tithe to him, and he would always say, oh, this check came at the best time. And when he would travel around the country to, spread the quote unquote true gospel, he would stop by casinos, his office, and gamble to get enough money to, fill up the gas tank for the next 100 miles.
Well, two questions I have about that. One serious and one not so serious. The not so serious one is, if he felt that way about casinos, I'm just wondering, what was his thoughts on Vegas? Is that just like his religion's Mecca, or what? Where are we at with Vegas? I feel like that's like the Holy Land.
Well, so, there's casinos all over the place, and he would usually try and hit the ones that were on the reservations. And so there's one in Southern California. I can't remember. It's on the way out to Palm Desert. And, he would go there all the time. And for me, it's like, listen, Jackson, you want to go to the casino on a Friday night with your buddies and play blackjack or whatever it is, play the slots and blow $50, have at it, have fun. But to think that you're going to beat the casino, that, you are going to be able to win. Well, listen, everybody who walked into the casino that night thought the same thing. And oh, by the way, the casinos are big buildings and they give you free drinks for a reason. The house always wins.
Exactly. Yeah. I'm with you there. The more serious question in all that is, obviously you talked about religious war when it comes to Christianity and Judaism. What did that do to him and to the people that, that followed him? Is it something that they kind of just listened and agreed, or did they live their life kind of as, anti-Semitic? Because that's a whole different thing. I don't know how much they took to heart with it, because that's scary if they took it really as to heart and actually lived that way towards, people of the Jewish faith.
Yeah, good question again. I never saw them act out anything at all. I certainly never did either. When I got married, my buddy from his school and college was Jewish. His last name was Schneider. I was in his wedding. He was in my wedding. So when Uncle Robert shared this at first, when he shared it, I was stunned. I was quite frankly scared. I thought, oh my gosh, this is really dark. And I thought we should have nothing to do with him. Of course, Paige was not going to go along with that. And I never followed up. I really should have pressed the issue. This would have been 3 years after we got married. But it was not something that was overt in our lives, not even in his life, really. But what it really did was kind of set the tone for the paranoia and secrecy. So cults control their members via numerous tools, but mostly paranoia and secrecy. So the paranoia is, well, certain Jews who are trying to control the world know that Uncle Robert's a threat. They know that Uncle Robert's on to them, right? Like Uncle Robert supposedly had a meeting with Alan Greenspan, the former chairman of the Fed. And so all these Jews know this. And of course, all the Jews are thus listening in on our cell phones. And they're probably going through Uncle Robert's trash. And oh, by the way, so we have to be careful. We have to watch what we say on our cell phones. We have to shred our trash, just like he does. And when he goes on trips, we can't ever say to him, hey, how is DC or New Mexico, or wherever he is? Because, of course, the Jews were listening. So since he is so wise and he knows the real truth, his life is in danger. Therefore, our lives are in danger. Therefore, we circle the wagons, we keep it secret, and we don't share with anybody. And now he has his control.
Yeah, and I want to ask you too, because an important part of the book was talking about how every teaching of somebody who is a cult leader is not crazy. It's not that that Jewish people are out to get you, and that casinos are the true churches. Those are some pretty crazy sounding things, but there's a lot of things too that cult leaders say that make sense, because you've got to put some sugar in there with some of the poison that you're giving, or you're not going to gain those followers initially. I think that's important, because you look at cult leaders out there and people are like, oh, this isn't, I've heard this from people that I've interviewed that have been in cults, that you start out like, oh, I don't think this is a cult because what they're saying actually makes sense. This isn't a bad thing, but then it slowly starts turning into something totally different. So speak on that a little bit. What did he talk about that was, that did make some sense? And then also just the larger picture of how, these things slowly start happening, and that, the things that make sense slowly start being convoluted into things that are dangerous, frankly.
Sure. Well, at first, a lot of what he said made sense. What I say is you never know you are in a cult. You only know you were in a cult, because cults can come in all shapes and sizes. They look very different. And certainly when people think of cults, they could think of really evil things like Jim Jones and David Koresh, where people are dying. But at its foundation, cults are all about undue mind control. So there was no abuse in the little cult of Uncle Robert, which we didn't really have a name for it. There was no violence. There was no abuse. There was no shouting or screaming or sex or anything like this. None of that. It was all about the undue mind control. And so I feel like I'm not the dumbest guy in the room. So I'm not just going to fall for a cult, right? Like nobody joins a cult. They only realize after the fact. They join what they think is legitimate. So the analogy I gave, or the metaphor is, if you mishit a golf ball, Jackson, by an eighth of an inch, quarter of an inch, 100 yards down the fairway, it's way off to the left or way off to the right, nowhere near the pit. Well, Uncle Robert would tee up the correct golf ball, so to speak. He would read from the Bible. But then he had a unique and perverse ability to take each and every verse and give it his odd twist, so that 5, 10, 15, 20 years down the road, we were way away from the gospel of Jesus Christ. But it was so slow. Like you said, I was the proverbial frog in the boiling water. And it took a long time to finally get to the point where I realized, how awful this was. Now, early on, I had a lot of doubts. The first 5 years or so, again, with the idea about the Jews trying to take over the world. At first, I thought this guy was crazy. But then little by little, oh, this makes sense, that makes sense, till I was fully brainwashed for probably about 2 to 3 years and really did not see it fully with eyes and ears open till about a year after Paige had left me and I was effectively kicked out of the cult.
So this book, I mean, you talk a lot about just all the situations. Are you looking kind of backwards, or during the time were you realizing that it was all pretty interesting? Because the book is written like every situation that you weren't really all that brainwashed. But so talk a little bit about that.
Sure. So in my memoir, Stop the Tall Man, Save the Tiger, what I tried to do was bring the reader along so you could kind of see some of my thinking and thought process in the moment. Obviously, I wrote it after the fact, after Paige had left me. I basically wrote it during COVID, right? Like I wrote like 4 to 5 hours a day and just couldn't stop. It was very cathartic and therapeutic to get it out of me. But I wanted the reader to see how subtle the process is. People will say, well, I would never let that happen to me. I would never join a cult. Fine, believe that. But I'm just telling you, it could happen to anybody. And again, I never planned on it. So the memoir, really the goal is to take you along this journey to see how it really could happen. It is kind of stunning, like, oh my gosh, he's not going to fall for it. And he finally does, the he being me. And so there are certainly a couple lessons along the way that I try to share in the book that provide people, kind of an insight into a cult, and also, red flags. How do you notice it? And let's say try and rescue a friend or family member. The biggest one being, Jackson, if you've got a friend, family member, someone you is in your bowling league, or you go gambling on Friday night with them, and all of a sudden that person cuts off all of their long-term relationships. You don't ever hear from a phone call or email. They don't show up to Bible study or whatever it is. That's a huge red flag. Doesn't mean they've joined a cult, but that is one of the signs, and that's a big red flag.
Another thing in what you said earlier, again, I've only been able to get through half of the book, so maybe you finish this story later on, but you mentioned a second ago that this cult, there was not, there wasn't any kind of harm, there wasn't any kind of abuse. I think they just kind of broke apart the family, because wasn't there a accusation of sexual abuse at some point?
Well, let me be clear. There was certainly a ton of abuse, but it would have been mental, emotional, and spiritual abuse. There was no physical abuse that I ever saw. And I was completely faithful my entire marriage. I even wanted to have a divorce. I loved my wife. Clearly, the last few years of the marriage were tough, but I still loved her, never wanted the divorce. Okay, so one of the siblings of Paige, and her family was all split up because of Uncle Robert. So you're correct in that. That family imploded, and it's still broken apart, as is mine. She did accuse Uncle Robert of things that, at the time it was explained to me, this is going back to 2000, it sounded almost like, he had, sexually assaulted her or raped her or something, which it was not. I found out years later what the actual accusations were when I reached out to this former sister-in-law, Rebecca. And it was, creepy, disgusting. If you did it to your child, we didn't want to punch him in the nose. Yes. Illegal? No. But really, really creepy. Was he grooming her for, let's say, a larger role later in life? Maybe. It's possible. Right around the time when my wife left me, I read a massive tome on Rasputin, the former spiritual guru to the last Tsar and Tsarina. It was fascinating, the parallels with him and Uncle Robert, because kind of this odd figure comes out of nowhere, broke, and has certainly an obsession with sex, and has this very cult-like following. People that love him or hate him, which is exactly the way people react to Uncle Robert. Most people just either dismiss him or they're totally devoted to him.
Yeah, and I want you now, because in the book you talk about quite a few just bizarre stories. I want you to kind of tell the listener a little bit about some of those things and just the grasp that he had on this particular family. The two that you mentioned in the email, I think, would be two that would really kind of show people what was happening, and that is about your wedding ring, and then ultimately about I guess the topic of surrogacy.
Sure. So, again, I absolutely adored and loved my wife. And I realized, 7, 8 years in, maybe 9, that she probably didn't really adore me or love me or honor me like she surely did Uncle Robert. And it was pointed out in very graphic terms in those two examples. So I lost my wedding band 2-3 years into our marriage. Couldn't find it, bought a new one. Many years later, I found the original wedding band in an old grungy jacket. I was working in the garden, found it, and I immediately showed it to Paige, and it brought on an instant wave of nostalgia, from the early days when we lived in Idaho, when we were first married, and our marriage was so wonderful, at least it was in my eyes. And so it was very representative and symbolic of what I hoped our marriage would one day turn back to. Well, at about that same time, Uncle Robert had told Paige that he lost his wedding band. So she asked me, said, you can't wear 2 of them, because I'd already bought a replacement. And so I sent him my original wedding band, and he wore it. And it was unseemly. It was awful, but I went along to get along. And I did a lot of that. I went along to get along. But on one topic, I did not go along, just to get along with Paige. And that was a few years later. We had a little tradition in our marriage where Friday night was date night and Saturday night was family night. So on a Friday night date night, we had 5 kids at the time. And we had talked about having a 6th, and we were hoping it would be a son. We would call him Matthew. So she got all dressed up, hair, makeup, the works. She looked great. We go to a coffee shop, and she tells me all about her burning desire to have another child, a son. And then she says, the son is for Uncle Robert. So Uncle Robert had 2 sons, and they married. They're now adults in their 40s. And they had daughters. They had no sons. So there was no one to carry on Uncle Robert's precious bloodline. So she wanted to have a male grandson with one of Uncle Robert's sons so that she could provide, this gift offering of a child so that Uncle Robert's bloodline could continue. And I was outraged. I mean, first of all, stunned and hurt that my wife of nearly 17, 18 years at this time would do this, would want to do this. And then what made it even worse was because she could tell I did not want it. I was completely against it. I chose my words carefully. I didn't explode because I knew that would just get me in more trouble. But thinking about her pregnant with Uncle Robert's grandson would make me, physically ill. Then she said, that she had taken a vow before the Lord that she would never have another child with me unless she could at least offer that gift to Uncle Robert and his son. And it was appalling, but it clearly showed, looking back, how devoted she was to him. I was still in denial. I still thought, well, we could work it out. She'll eventually fall madly in love with me again. But she never did.
Yeah, and I want to also kind of, if those don't drive the point home, which I think they certainly do, just how much of a grasp that he had, and still probably does on this family. I guess another story that I think kind of shows that is because he was the expert on everything. That's what she said. Even things that would make absolutely no sense that he would have, expertise on. Talk about a little bit about that devotion and how it played a part in I guess daily life. One part that was interesting to me was that you guys needed to consult him when your son was getting his teeth worked on, which is pretty crazy. So talk a little bit about just that devotion and his expertise, and then that particular story.
Sure. So my 2 oldest boys were like 7 and 5 at the time, and they're wrestling on the bed, and if you're a parent listening to this, those moments. They're wonderful. You cherish them. And I'm sitting there on the bed with them, watching it. And then in an instant, it turns into a nightmare. One of the kids, front teeth hit the other kid's back of their head. They're both crying. So the older boy, his 2 front teeth are wiggly, and they're amazing. They didn't fall out. So we go to the dentist the next morning, and the dentist kind of said to do one thing, and then later on says to do something else. So we're sitting there in his office, and Paige refused to let the dentist do the procedure he wanted to, which was just install a little bar to keep the teeth in place so they could reset. But we were not going to proceed until she could get Uncle Robert on the phone and talk to him and ask his opinion. And by the way, he was never a doctor, never a dentist, didn't have a medical license of any kind that I know of. But because she respected his opinion more than anybody else, we made this dentist who had been in this town for like decades wait until we conversed with Uncle Robert. And then, of course, he was like, oh, yeah, that's fine. Do what the dentist says. But Paige had to run it by Uncle Robert. Now, that's one example. There are hundreds. Another one, which you might find fascinating, was Uncle Robert knew next to nothing about sports. He wouldn't know a basketball from a football. And the fact that I did drove him nuts, because I love using sports as a metaphor for life. I love using sports stories to help explain life. The discipline we learn, obeying authority and hard work and setting goals, all the things that you could learn by being a player or a coach, right? And he didn't know anything about it. So it drove him nuts. And so then when I wrote my first book, The Blue Team, which is about faith in basketball, he was very critical. And when I did the first draft, was about to publish it, he and my father-in-law at the time thought, it's a travesty, makes a mockery of Christianity. And if you publish it, you'll regret it for the rest of your life. So I went back to the drawing board and actually changed it a little bit, which the irony is I think I made the story better, and then did publish the book. But when it came to things like that, he was either fully dismissive of it, and thus our involvement in it, or he was going to dictate how, what, where, when, and why.
So, I think there's 2 kind of unfathomable things when we're listening to this story. The first one is just, you said that he met this family in seminary and that they kind of just gravitated towards him. Why do you think all this is? Do you think that the father-in-law, which I believe was Jack, was just super impressionable and needed someone to listen to? Or why do you think he had such a grip on these people? Because it doesn't really make any sense. He's not anything like them. It's not like he's wealthy and everyone's aspiring to be like him when it comes to that. It just doesn't make sense of why they care so much about this fella.
Well, that's a hard question for me to answer because, for people listening, you might be thinking, well, again, Peter, why did you fall for this? Well, if I was not married to Paige, I would have sat down with a cup of coffee with, Uncle Robert Booty. And within 20 minutes, I would have thought, well, he's kind of interesting, but he's a crackpot. And I would never have followed him. Certainly, I would never have followed him once I got into all this theology. I would have ran away as fast as I could. So then why did Jack? Well, I knew Jack for, over 20 years. He was my father-in-law, at times a very kind man, but clearly a very misled and brainwashed person that relied on Uncle Robert for everything. One thing that is common, I believe, in cult members is that the cult leader will make you doubt everything. And so by the end of these 20 years, I doubted every single thought and word. Like, it was hard to do anything. Like, if I bonked my front teeth and went to the dentist, 20 years in, I might have waited to call Uncle Robert. It was that bad. I doubted every single thing, which when I look back is crazy to me, but it shows the depth of the brainwashing, that he was the expert on everything. And it's fine to have someone that you look up to and he's an expert. But the flip side of that coin, the dark side of that coin, is that now you doubt every single thing that you've ever done, ever thought, ever done. It has to get run by him. And that really is the best description of Jack, is that he doubts everything. Even the fact that, he was a father of 5 children, but now feeling like he was a fraud, he was never a Christian until much later in life when Uncle Robert, quote unquote, saved him. He's now very dismissive of the fact that he was a father to those 5 children and raised 5 children. So I don't know if I have the answer, Jackson, to whether or not, when you go back 50 some odd years and Jack met Robert, what was it? Again, I can tell you, for some people, he is very charismatic. He's also very narcissistic. Some people would see right through it. Others, they're just a bit more susceptible. And it's hard for me to really pinpoint why.
I think that a lot of times, looking back, hindsight is 20/20. It's really hard to truly understand these things. Your marriage eventually dissolved, but it was your wife who decided that it wasn't something that she wanted to be in anymore. Before I get to that part, I guess I had thought that, and again, I haven't finished the book, but I had thought that, you had kind of been doubting the entire time, and that she finally just had been like, well, if you can't join the ship, then jump off. But it sounds like you were doing quite a bit and sticking with it. So what happened there?
Oh, well, so how do I unwind this, without taking too much time? But, if you go back to, and we can talk about the title of the book, but, Uncle Robert had convinced Paige she wasn't a Christian, and she believed him. So thus he acted as the gatekeeper to God. You have to go through Uncle Robert to be saved, which of course is utter nonsense, but Paige believed it. And that was right before we got married. And then her father a few years later, and then her mother a few years later. Then about 12 years later, it was my turn. And I was just worn down and beaten down by this Uncle Robert and my wife. And they just kept, telling me these things, and maybe I'm missing something. So I finally caved, allowed him to, quote unquote, save me, which I now know is utterly fraudulent and wicked. And I never should have believed this little man, but I did. So as I saw the writing on the wall, so to speak, I was also at that point now almost fully brainwashed. And the writing on the wall was, my wife still doesn't love me. She still doesn't trust me. She still doesn't really respect me. And I was desperate for that. I was desperate to have a great marriage. I still love this woman, despite how awful it had gotten at that point, the last year or two of our marriage. And so, at that point, I kind of stopped asking the tough questions and instead was really trying hard to embrace this little cult leader. Again, I wouldn't have thought that in my mind, but I was really trying hard to, in my mind, say, okay, all these years I've been resisting this guy. Maybe I was wrong. Maybe I'll really try hard to grasp what he is offering. And then when I see it, well, Paige and I will now have this wonderful marriage like I've always wanted. So that's why, I kind of hung in there. And Paige, just thought I was a fraud and just was faking it and never truly was a believer. And then about a month after she left, it got really, really bad. Unfortunately, it took a huge turn for the worse.
In the book, you say it too about how you just kind of got along to get along, and that was kind of a theme that you were just desperately trying to figure out exactly what was needed of you, and also how to, I guess, regain this respect and potentially love of your wife. The thing that I guess that it's a little bit, we talked about it before we started, but also it's a little bit, I guess, awkward to say, but it just seems to me, and the thing that I wonder about is because you were just trying so hard to figure out exactly what was needed of you. If she would have, accepted that, hey, okay, you're now saved by Uncle Robert, you're going along with everything, would you have continued to go along to get along? Would you have still been married? Do you think you ever would have actually kind of realized what was happening to you? I just wonder whether we're talking because it blew up or because you actually would have ever figured it out.
Well, another great question. And that's the one I really don't have the answer to, but it's fascinating to think about, right? So after Paige left me, I was desperate to get her back, and I would have, done practically anything at that point for the first few months. And, our divorce really wasn't final until, oh my gosh, our divorce was, I think, 3.5 years after she left me before it was finally finalized. So, and I kind of dragged it out because I didn't want it. So would I still be in it, here in 2023? I don't know. God forbid I would still be, right? But then what would the catalyst have been to get me out of it? I do think, Jackson, that as long as Uncle Robert was a presence in Paige's life, our marriage was doomed. Whether it was a year in or 50 years in, it was going to happen. As long as he was alive, and as long as he had that position in her life, our marriage was doomed. What would it have looked like if she didn't leave me in 2017? I don't know. I don't have an answer to that. Kind of scary too, really, to think about it, because yes, my family imploded. My marriage got broken up. It was devastating. And what I went through was horrendous, and I would never wish it on anybody else. But I am a much stronger man because of it. And my children have been rescued from a tiny, destructive religious cult.
Yeah, absolutely. I guess I just wonder, so much did happen that you did continue to try to figure it out. I just wonder, I don't know. I guess I'm a little lost for words of how you, and I think that a lot of people listening would be kind of just at a loss to figure out exactly why at the end it wasn't like, finally, this is over with and I don't have to deal with this craziness anymore, that you were for several months being like, I want to work this out. I want to get this back. I mean, what was going through your head? Obviously, I understand that, you were married for 20 plus years, but you really weren't really being treated all that well. So was it almost just like, I don't know, survivor's guilt, or I don't really understand it.
Well, let me see if I can try and put to words what you were suggesting or getting at, and that is that Paige is a different person now than she was when I married her, and so there was always this ability for her to turn into this person because of Uncle Robert always in her ear feeding her his thoughts. But the woman that I married in 1997 is not the same person that she is now, nor has she been the same person for the last probably 10 years or so. So there was a huge change that I saw, and I firmly believe that, without Uncle Robert in her life, she could be that person again. So the real issue I have is not so much Paige, as hard as that is when you read my book to grasp, but it's really Uncle Robert. Because, and again, for people that have been on, in the firing line of, Paige and her words, I mean, she could be brutal with her letters and emails, and in person, the vitriol that she spews at people. And I was the direct, object. I was the target for a long time. But she is a victim, just like I was, just like my children were, because she has been under the undue mind control of Uncle Robert her entire life. If you have trouble with the word cult, there's a guy named Stephen Hassan, or Hassan. He wrote a great book, Combating Cult Mind Control. He says, listen, if cult, can only conjure up images of Jim Jones and drinking the Kool-Aid, fine. Think of it as undue mind control. Well, Uncle Robert has had that over Paige her entire life. I saw a glimpse of the Paige without that. And I guess I always wanted that. I never wanted to get divorced. I always dreamed of having a wonderful, happy marriage and family. I felt like we had it for a time, And it was devastating to see it torn away from me.
Yeah, and I think that's really important what you said. It reminds me of a very different situation, but the same type of thing where about a year and a half ago, I interviewed somebody who had experienced sexual abuse in the church. Their youth pastor had molested them as a child. And the thing that we talked about, and that a lot of people have talked to her about, was how now she's friends with that pastor's ex-wife who knew about it the entire time. So everyone's always like, how in the world could you be friends with that person? How with they knew about this and they allowed it to happen? And what she mentioned was she was just as much a victim of him as I was. She was under the same spell as I was. It was so it's almost at that point victim shaming to think about her in a bad way. And I feel like it's easy to fall in that trap because that's kind of what I'm doing here with Paige, but she's a victim too. She just hasn't realized it yet.
Yeah, and she is responsible, as we all are, for her words and her actions and her deeds and everything she has done. She broke up a marriage. Again, I was completely faithful our entire marriage, as I would imagine she was as well. But you know what? I mean, I can't imagine if she were to finally have her eyes and ears opened by the Lord and to really see what she has done with her life and what Moody has done to her. Can't imagine what it would be like for her. I mean, it'd be unbelievably difficult because, again, I was brainwashed, I don't know, let's say 3 years roughly. Make it 4, but probably only 3. It took me a year to get over it. I can't imagine how hard it would be for her. But, I used to pray for her every day. I don't do it every day now, I'll admit, but I used to pray for her every day for years that she would have a road to Damascus type moment. So the road to Damascus where Saul becomes Paul. He's persecuting the Christians, and then he writes half the New Testament, roughly. And, but the Lord doesn't need me to write a book to help him. He can figure it out. And if he wants to give Paige that moment, he will.
Yeah. And I just in the people that I've interviewed when it comes to cults before, from what I gather, definitely given that she has been in it for so long, even if she were to see the light, so to speak, it's at this point, it's a lifelong process. I've interviewed people who left a cult in 1978 and 1978, and they still to this day say they're still not completely over it. There's still people living the way that particular cult leader had them live, which he passed away back then. That's what broke up the cult. But I don't think I don't want to say unsalvageable, but I don't think that there's really a way at this point to completely be, normal, if that's the word. I don't really like that word, but I think that as you saw just in your 3 or 4 years of being mind controlled with it and how long it took you, I think that it would just times that by what, 30, 40 years, it would be interesting.
Paige's younger sister, who was shunned and ostracized and has been for now 23 years, Rebecca, put it really well. When I hadn't talked to her in a long time, one of my brothers reached out and found her because, again, she had been totally shunned. We weren't even allowed to say her name in our house because Paige didn't want any of the kids to remember her, their aunt. So he reached out to her and found her and told her what happened with Paige and I, and then we finally reconnected. And she said, it'll take you a while because it took her years because, she grew up with Uncle Robert and then, got kicked out when she was in her early 20s. But she said it'll take you a while before you will be able to read the Bible, engage in a conversation, read a book, and not hear Uncle Robert's voice in your head, his voice giving you the instruction on what to think. And I remember thinking at the time, oh boy, I hope it doesn't take that long. But she was right. I don't think it took years for me, but there were plenty of times where I had already been kind of kicked out. I felt like I was pretty healthy mentally and spiritually and emotionally. I'd recovered thanks to friends, family, and my faith. But, I'd still hear things, hear trigger words, trigger subjects, and his voice would be in my head. Far seldom now, hardly ever hear it, but it was there for a long time. And I think that might be what you're getting at. You can still be a completely healthy person, but it's kind of like a physical scar, right? Like, you tear your ACL, you get it fixed, but you still got a little scar there. And I think that is kind of the way I would describe what you're saying, is that you can be fully recovered and healthy, but that little voice might crop up every now and then.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Just in that example of that person, that cult leader had taught them eating meat is basically the devil. You should never do that. she still has really a lot of hard time eating meat. She loves cheeseburgers, but every time she still feels a little guilty about it. So yeah, that's kind of is what I was getting at. So we've only talked about this one family. Is what this control, was it just, I know that it was a small group of was it just simply this one family group that he had controlled?
So a lot of cults do like to expand. They're constantly trying to recruit other members, right? And they get pretty big. The Moonies, for example. Ours was quite small. I really never saw a push to try and bring other people in. It was much more the exact opposite of, the secrecy and the paranoia and circle the wagons. So there would have been, our little family. So my wife and I, and then our 5 kids, and then Paige's parents, and then one older brother. So Paige was one of 5. The 3 youngest siblings had been shunned and ostracized because of booty. And then all of the Clausen relatives from Canada. So the aunts and the uncles, the cousins, all of them shunned. Now, there was a brother Michael, he was kind of the follower of Uncle Robert. Think of Batman and Robin. That was, Batman was Uncle Robert, and Robin would have been, this brother Michael character, and a few other guys. But I would say at its apex, at its biggest, it would have been, maybe 10, 12 adults, and then the kids. So, never very big. There was never the Jones, the Smiths, the Andersons, the whomever. And if they existed, Jackson, I never saw them. And I don't think they did.
So why do you think that was the case, that there was never expanded? I mean, you talked about, let's just talk about the economics of it. You talked about how he didn't work, his wife did. They never had much money. I believe a lot of you guys were tithing to this person. So the more people he had following, the more money he would have brought in. So what makes you, was it just that a small group he could control better, or why do you think that was the case?
Another way I think I've heard that same question is, what was in it for him? People would ask me, well, what was in it for him if there wasn't this huge following? Because you astutely bring up that, yes, we would tithe, which in the Christian faith, that means, a tenth of what you get, you give back to the Lord, right? As a way of saying thanks. So we would all tithe to him. We would send him money every month. And, by the way, he would gamble. So, you connect those dots however you wish. But it was a small group. And so we were not bringing in other people. So there was not the chance for all of this other, wealth and riches to be accumulated. My thought is that it was all about control and how this small little group made him feel. We adored him. We revered him. I didn't for that long, but the other people did. And that's got to be an incredible feeling for, a narcissist like he was, to have these people adore him. And he would also, I remember him saying once that, he was not called, like he felt like the Lord had called him to do this, to spread the true gospel, and that was, of course, his gospel. So he was not called to baptize. He was not called to do this or have a big church, et cetera, et cetera. So he must not have felt called to, lead a large group. It was more like he has the corner on, biblical, let's say, defining what the gospel really means, biblical truth. And he didn't really care how many close followers he had, as long as those in power get an audience with them, which speaks to another key attribute of cult leaders. They have a grandiose sense of self, as it's called. And that was clearly Uncle Robert. He claimed to have conversations with Alan Greenspan and other congressmen, representatives, and senators. He'd go to D.C. and he was on a first-name basis with them. And before Gulf War number 2 in the early 2000s, he sent a letter to Saddam Hussein telling him what to do. And Saddam Hussein wasn't smart enough to listen to this guy in America. And we'd hear stories like this all the time. So he clearly had a grandiose sense of self.
Yeah, and you said before we started talking about how probably the most important part, or the most important person in this cult, in this brainwashing, was Paige, because of who she was. She was highly educated, and he realized from an early point that he needed to keep her engaged. So I want you to talk a little bit about the depths that he went to, the links that he went to make that happen. I think this is where we can kind of talk about kind of the convoluted dream, the book that you wrote. It ties into that dream. So talk a little bit about that.
Sure. I want to go back real quick to that book by Stephen Hassan, Combating Cult Mind Control. He was in the Moonies, which is large. He wrote his book a long time ago and then did an update to it a few years ago. And he said the biggest change between, let's say, the last 10 years to back in the 70s and 80s is the rise of these mini cults, anywhere from like 2 to 12 people. And I bet you there's a lot of these little cults running around. We, of course, were in one. And again, they're all about control. So this cult is really small. Uncle Robert is about 5'6". He's portly, completely bald, olive complexion, bulbous nose, jet black hair. He has no large following, doesn't have a lot of money. He's not very accomplished, doesn't have a big church or a career, is rather homely looking. And so then here is Paige, right? He's got this little family under his thumb. And Paige is tall, beautiful. She's got 2 master's degrees, and she's well-spoken. And so she walks into a room, and here is this woman, and she listens and adores and reveres this little man. Well, Paige gives Uncle Robert instant cachet. And without her, where is Uncle Robert? Well, this all is the buildup to, why did I call my book Stop the Tall Man, Save the Tiger? Like, where in the world did you get that title from? All right, so before I met Paige in 1996, she had been baptized. And when you get baptized, you publicly profess your faith. But Uncle Robert wasn't there, didn't do the baptizing and wasn't there, drove him nuts. A few months later, before she met me, she has a dream. And in the dream, which she believed was from the Lord, she's in a house with a boyfriend. There's a tiger on the loose, and she knows the tiger, if it finds her, it's going to kill her. But she doesn't want to kill the tiger. She just wants to kind of know where it is, control it, stay away from it, because the tiger represents things that she admires in life: strength, honor, respect, duty, etc. So then the door of the house opens, and a tall man walks in. She flees. She's scared for the tiger. The boyfriend disappears, and she can't see the face of the tall man. And the tall man is there to kill the tiger. So she has this dream. I don't know if she has it a number of times. So it's obviously disturbing. It's a big deal to her. She writes a letter, sends it to Uncle Robert. Uncle Robert writes this 24-page bizarre letter and sends it to Paige. And she gets it right after I meet her. So again, I look back, on the calendar. Well, what day was Sunday, in late October? He wrote the letter on a Wednesday, sent it on a Friday. And then that Sunday, Paige and I met for the first time. So remember, Uncle Robert has a face that Paige knows really well. Well, I believe that I was the tall man in the dream, and she couldn't see the face of the tall man because she hadn't met me yet. And oh, by the way, I'm 6'5". So in this long letter of interpretation, Booty tries to claim that he's the tall man, even though he's about 5'6". He obviously doesn't know who the tall man is because he hasn't met me yet either. Oh, and in real life, Chad, the boyfriend in the dream, he showed up to the second week of that singles Bible study, and I never saw him again. So in the dream, he disappears when I show up, and in real life, I met him one time, disappeared. Okay, so in the letter, Booty, who is again 5'6", tries to claim he's the tall man, and then convinces Paige that she is the tiger, that she is unsaved, not a Christian, and the tiger is her old ego, the old Paige that we are saved from when we truly become Christians. So in essence, he turns the dream on his head. He's the hero. She's the villain. She's not saved. And she, Paige, needs Uncle Robert to save her. And thus, that kept her underneath his thumb. Because if Paige can go ahead and get baptized and be saved without Uncle Robert, well, why do we need Uncle Robert? And that dream has had lasting repercussions to this day, because I truly do believe that dream was from the Lord, and it was a warning. And I was there to be a conduit, let's say, to help her see that this guy was destroying her. And anyway, I did not really get it until, 20, 23 years later. I really finally saw, oh my gosh. Like I remember telling that dream, like I just told you, the audience, I told that dream without my interpretation of it. And then these 2 people were like, oh, I know what that dream means. Like instantly they knew what it meant. And then so did I. And unfortunately, Paige still doesn't see it. I tried to explain it to her once. We were in counseling and it went nowhere, and she just disagreed. And it's so sad. But Booty was able to twist it, turn it, manipulate her. And I believe he still controls her to this day.
Then I guess I want to ask you with that. Let's use that exact example where she sent him a letter. She told him about this dream, and he found a way to kind of construe it into, making sure that she stayed loyal to him and that it was a calling based on him. He had turned it into that. Writing that letter, what do you think his purpose in that is? And the larger question with that is, because there's cult leaders that truly feel like they have a calling and that they are helping people and that it's a passion, whether it makes any sense or not. There's cult leaders like that. And then there's some that will just go along to get along, just to keep power. Do you think that he believed everything he said, or do you think it was he would say what he needed to say in order to continue the control that he had?
Right. Yeah. Do I think he was honest, or do I think he was saying whatever he needed to control Paige? I think in his mind, he believed it. I think in his mind, he believed every word of it. Yeah. To me, I think that's kind of the sign of the narcissist. I mean, he was acting as a gatekeeper to God, grandiose sense of self, that Paige needed him. It's kind of like, the phrase, if a tree falls in the forest and no one is there to hear it, does it make a sound? Well, in our little cult, I had already been saved as a teenager. Paige had already been saved. She publicly professed her faith, was baptized. Her parents had been saved before they met Robert Booty in their probably late 20s, early 30s. But yet all of us were convinced that we had not been saved until we allowed Booty to save us. So in our little cult, it was kind of like, if someone is saved and becomes a Christian, but Uncle Robert's not there to witness it, does it really matter? Which is awful to say, but it's pretty darn accurate. So to answer your question, Jackson, I think he believes every bit of it. Yeah.
So before we started too, you talked about this, and I think it kind of puts a nice stamp on the end of it, because I think that you realize just how deep it went and just how, I guess, broken your marriage was. And that was when at the end you had heard kind of what was happening the entire time with your marriage, the confessions that she had sent him. Talk a little bit about that and kind of how things blew up at the end.
Well, there were several discoveries that I made after she had left. For a while we shared one laptop, and so there was just some things that I saw on there. One was her testimony. So again, in the Christian faith, your testimony is, what has the Lord done for you? Or how did you become a Christian, right? And when I read hers, and I'd heard it in person, when I read it, it was like, boy, who saved her, Uncle Robert or Jesus Christ? Uncle Robert's name was mentioned more times. So that was kind of eye-opening. I read another letter she had written way back in 2000. Real briefly, the story with this one is our second child was born 8 weeks premature, nearly died in the womb. She went into the hospital on bed rest. She was leaking amniotic fluid. The doctors never knew why, but she sure did. She felt like the Lord was punishing her because she had not come to the defense of Uncle Robert quick enough when her sister was, making these claims against him. She briefly believed her sister. So she felt, the Lord was endangering her life and our son's life because she did not honor Robert Booty quick enough. So she wrote a whole letter about that, multiple pages. And I found this, my jaw dropped. I hadn't seen it. I mean, it was probably 21 years after the fact. And I kind of knew a little bit about how she felt, but I was stunned that this is the depths to which she felt her life revolved around Uncle Robert. And then, of course, I found the original letter that Uncle Robert had written to her back in 1996. So I found all of these things like a year or two after she left. And it really helped me fit all the puzzle pieces together to come to the conclusion that I've already said, that, as long as he was in our lives, our marriage was doomed.
So what made you decide to write this book? Obviously, there's a lot of parts that could be triggering. I mean, it is your life we're talking about. So what made you decide that you wanted to share it with others?
Well, first of all, in writing it was very cathartic, very therapeutic. I do believe if you've ever been through something traumatic, writing it down on paper was very helpful for me. That's what I did during COVID. I wrote like 4 or 5 hours a day and got the book done. Cults operate on secrecy and paranoia, and they control the followers. So much of what I've shared tonight, my family, now I'm one of 5 sons, my parents, my brothers, their wives, nieces and nephews, they knew very little of this. And I kept it secret from them, the Young family, not the Clauses, my family. I kept it from them for decades. And I held all this in for a long time, and it ate me up. And, probably will send me to an earlier grave. So I didn't want to be silent anymore. I wanted to share my story because I didn't want to be silent. And so if my story, whether you read my book or you're listening to this podcast, or however you're going to hear this story, if it can change one life, rescue one family, prevent someone from joining a cult, whatever it may be, then it was worth it. And I just didn't want to be silent anymore. I wanted the truth to become known.
Yeah, I understand that. And I want you to now just tell us, and we're in present day now, what, these are real people, the actors in your book, where's everybody at today? I want to kind of I know that some of your family has has joined you. I just want to know kind of where we stand now, and then kind of to piggyback off of that. You talked about how this cult is based on secrecy, like many of them are. Well, you kind of threw it out there into the open, so I don't know whether you know anything about how they feel about this. I'm sure they feel just grand.
Well, the funny thing is, I don't know if Paige or her parents or Uncle Robert even know about the book. I would imagine they do, but that speaks to how little contact I have with them. So as far as I know, Uncle Robert's still alive. He'd be in his late 70s. I have not talked with him either via phone, person, or email since 2018. So it's been 5 years. I don't talk to, Paige's parents, and I very seldom talk to Paige. It's still very tense. It's awful, and we're still going through the courts. Unfortunately, she called me a murderer and a documented abuser in a recent court filing, which of course I haven't murdered anybody or abused anybody. So it's sad to see. It's difficult that it's still getting dragged on. Out of my 5 children, the 3 youngest still live with me. The courts sent them back to me back in 2018. They saw the influence of the cult, which is abusive emotionally. So they're doing well. I mean, we all have our ups and downs, but they do still love their mom. And I don't badmouth her, and she will always be their mom, so they should love her. But they see the truth with Uncle Robert Booty. They know what happened, and so they are very healthy now. They're much stronger. They have recovered. They still have a long way to go, as we all do. It'll probably always linger a little bit in the background. My 2 oldest boys, it's a little bit of work in progress. It's hard to blame them with everything that they went through, but I do pray for them that hopefully one day we can reconnect, and that relationship will be repaired. And then my family, the young family, my brothers and my parents are still alive, and they're in their late 80s. And again, this obviously, rocked them to the core when they found out about it, but they have all rallied around me and showered me with love and support, which is what a family should do.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I think that is an easy way to see that this was a mess to begin with, because that isn't what happened in this family. When things went wrong, people were shunned. So I like that, the people you surround yourself with now are supportive, as they should be. And I want you now just to tell us how people find the book. We covered a kind of a very, as you said earlier, a Reader's Digest version of this book. So I want you to tell people how they can read more about each of the things we talked about.
Sure. So the name of the book, again, is Stop the Tall Man, Save the Tiger. You can get it on Amazon, exclusively on Amazon. You can also find my other book, The Blue Team, the novel, is also on Amazon. And if you want more information about me, my website is authorpeteryoung.com. I also have my own YouTube channel, which is at author Peter Young. I love to read, so I do videos on book reviews, and I also do little kind of story vignettes on some of the stuff that's in the book. Also, some of the stuff that's not in the book. I couldn't fit every anecdote into the book. It just would have been too long. So I've got some of that stuff online.
Yeah. Well, I'll tell you, it's been an absolute pleasure speaking with you. I really appreciate you.
Thank you very much, Jackson, for having me on. I appreciate it.
So that was Peter Young. Hope you enjoyed that conversation. Hope you learned a lot. Like I mentioned in the beginning of this episode, the growth of these micro cults is just, it can't not be ignored. There's not a ton of these cults that we know about anymore. Of course, there's been some in the news when it comes to, the fundamental church, the FLDS and that type of thing, and Warren Jeffs and those type of things have been in the news. But what we don't see and what most people don't hear about is these micro cults that have just a few people in them that it just rocks the world. And I think that you learn just how interesting and just how impactful it was for Peter. There was a time during the marriage that he was bought in as well, whether it was because he was just trying to save his marriage, or whether he was truly feeling that way. That's to be determined, I guess. But I learned so much from Peter. It's you talk to Peter just like I've talked to other people in cults, and you think that he seems like a really smart guy. He doesn't seem like somebody who could be dragged into something like this. It just goes to show how powerful these things can be, and I don't think any of us are immune to falling into people who say all the right things and say things smoothly and make you feel like you're not very smart if you don't agree with them, and that's how people gain power. So I hope you learned a lot from this. If you're sitting there and maybe you're thinking, hey, I know somebody who's acting like this a bit, then hey, don't take 20 years to realize what's happening like happened with Peter here. So I hope you'll check out his book, both of his books. They'll be in the show notes for you to check those out and pick you up a copy. I also will put a link to his YouTube in the show notes. He's got some awesome resources there where he talks, in depth about more aspects of cults and whether you're in one yourself. I think that you're going to learn a lot there. It's just a fascinating topic and one that I think that we could all learn a lot from. So I hope you'll check him out. If this is your first time listening to this podcast, appreciate you being here. Go leave a 5-star review on Apple and on Spotify. Go leave a written review on Apple. Even more amazing. Follow along on Instagram, Not in a Huff Podcast, JacksonF.com, Not in a Huff with Jackson Huff on Facebook. All those places. Appreciate you supporting the podcast. If you do nothing else, catch us next week. Another amazing guest. Take it away, Chris.
This has been Not in a Huff with Jackson Huff. Thank you for listening. Be sure to join us next time where we will interview another amazing guest who is sure to make you laugh or make you think. Or, hey, maybe even both. But until then, keep being awesome.